5 real horror encounters shared by ex-military officer. Story 1. The Warning of the Mountains. My early career and military deployment. I was just 20 years old when I graduated as a second lieutenant from the heroic military college. My first assignment was with the 93rd Infantry Battalion, stationed deep in the heart of Guerrero's mountains, in a remote municipality called Tlapa de Comonfort. This unit was what we called 100% operational, meaning we were almost always on missions 7 or 8 months at a time in the Sierra, with only 2 or 3 days of rest before heading back out. It was grueling work, but I was eager to prove myself. When I arrived at the battalion, the operations chief, Major Castillo, gathered all the new officers for a briefing. He assigned each of us to a section and outlined our operational areas. I was excited but nervous. This was my first real deployment. However, during that meeting, I noticed something strange. The battalion commander, Colonel Juan Jose Baranda Rivera, seemed hesitant when my name came up. He suggested that another officer, Sub-Lieutenant Locadio, should take command of one of the fixed operational bases instead of me. Locadio had risen through the ranks from soldier to officer and had far more field experience than I did as a fresh graduate. Though disappointed, I followed orders and was assigned as an escort to transport Locadio to his base. We made our way through rugged terrain until we reached a small village where he would be stationed. After dropping him off, we stopped briefly in another village called Olanala to buy supplies for the return trip. That's when an old man approached me. He must have been around 60 years old, with weathered skin and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through me. He said something that sent a shiver down my spine. Don't travel on December 11th, the day of St. Balthazar. The evil one roams freely on that day. I thanked him politely but dismissed his warning as mere superstition. It was December 7th at the time, so I didn't give it another thought. The tragedy. 4 days later, on December 11th, I was on duty at the battalion when an urgent message came through from Olanala's mayor. A military convoy had been in an accident. Without hesitation, I reported to Colonel Baranda, who ordered me to take a platoon and investigate immediately. The scene was worse than anything I could have imagined. The truck had veered off the road into a shallow ravine, barely 40 centimeters deep, but the devastation was inexplicable. 11 soldiers were dead, their bodies scattered among twisted metal and debris. The driver had been crushed in his seat, and Sub-Lieutenant Locadio was nowhere to be found. I questioned one of the survivors, a young corporal who had only minor injuries. His account chilled me to my core. We were returning from a nearby village when an old man warned us not to travel that day, but we didn't listen. As we drove along the winding road, it felt like something grabbed the truck from behind. A force so strong it shook us violently and threw us into the ravine. He paused before adding something even stranger. There were no skid marks on the road. We weren't speeding. And when we crashed, we heard dogs howling all around us. But there are no dogs in this area. As he spoke, villagers began arriving at the scene with candles in hand, murmuring prayers under their breath. Among them was the same old man who had warned me days earlier. He looked at me with an expression of sorrow and said softly, "You see? They didn't believe me, and now the evil one has taken them." I didn't know what to say. My mind raced with questions that had no answers. Why were there no tire marks? Why did Locadio disappear without a trace? And why did so many witnesses report hearing those infernal howls? The haunting begins. As dawn broke over the mountains, we prepared to leave with what remained of our platoon and equipment. On our way back to base, something caught my eye, a figure standing motionless on the side of the road ahead. It looked like Locadio. We stopped immediately and approached cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. But when we reached where he should have been, there was nothing there but shadows. When we finally returned to base later that morning, I recounted everything to my team. That's when one of the guards told me something even more unsettling. Sub-Lieutenant Locadio came back here last night. I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked. He showed up around midnight, the guard said matter-of-factly. Said he forgot his wallet and left quickly. But there were 5 dogs following him. The weight of his words sank into my chest like lead. How could Locadio have been here if he disappeared after the crash? And why would he be followed by dogs, especially in this desolate region where no strays roamed? That night, none of us slept, a place touched by evil. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences became routine at our base near Tlapa de Comonfort. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any. Whispers echoed through empty halls. Soldiers reported seeing figures lurking just beyond our perimeter. One soldier, nicknamed La Parca for his grim sense of humor, claimed he saw a woman standing near his tent one night. She told him softly, "Be careful. This place has been touched by evil." When he turned to get a better look at her face, she vanished. The final straw came when we discovered an altar hidden behind our camp, a pyramid of stones drenched in dried blood and surrounded by animal remains. None of us dared touch it. Instead, we buried it under layers of dirt and prayed it would stay forgotten. But deep down, we all knew something had awakened in those mountains, and it wasn't going to let us go easily. Looking back now, years after leaving Guerrero's cursed mountains behind me, I still can't explain what happened during those harrowing months with any certainty. All I know is this: evil exists not just as an abstract concept, but as something tangible that can reach out and take hold of you when you least expect it. And sometimes warnings come too late. Story 2. The Howls in the Night. My first supernatural encounter. It was December 11th, the day of St. Balthazar. I had forgotten about the old man's warning from a few days earlier. His words about evil roaming freely seemed like nothing more than local superstition at the time. That morning, I was on duty at the battalion when a sergeant radioed me urgently. The mayor of Olanala, a nearby village, had called to report an accident involving one of our military convoys. My heart sank as I relayed the news to Colonel Baranda. He ordered me to take a platoon and investigate immediately. The drive to the crash site felt endless. The roads were narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest and steep cliffs. When we finally arrived, the scene before us was devastating. The truck had veered off the road into a shallow ravine, barely 40 centimeters deep, but the damage was catastrophic. 11 of my comrades lay dead, their bodies twisted and broken among the wreckage. The driver had been crushed in his seat, and Sub-Lieutenant Locadio, who had been leading the convoy, was nowhere to be found. I approached one of the survivors, a young corporal who was trembling but unharmed save for a few scratches. His voice shook as he recounted what had happened. We were returning from Olanala after trying to buy supplies when an old man warned us not to travel today. He said it wasn't safe, but we didn't listen. The corporal paused, his eyes darting nervously toward the wreckage before continuing. As we drove along the road, it felt like something grabbed the truck from behind, a force so strong it shook us violently and threw us into the ravine. I frowned. "Were you speeding?" I asked. He shook his head vehemently. "No, sir. There weren't even any skid marks on the road." That's when he added something that made my blood run cold. After we crashed, we heard dogs howling all around us. But there are no dogs in this area. The hand beneath the truck. As I processed his words, villagers began arriving at the scene with candles in hand, murmuring prayers under their breath. Among them was the same old man who had warned me days earlier in Olanala. He approached me solemnly and said, "You see? They didn't believe me, and now the evil one has taken them." I wanted to dismiss his words as paranoia, but something about his tone, calm yet full of certainty, unnerved me. While supervising the recovery efforts, I noticed something strange near the back of the truck. Beneath one of its rear wheels, partially obscured by mud and debris, was a hand, pale and lifeless. My stomach churned as we pulled out the body. It was one of our missing soldiers, clutching his rifle tightly even in death. But there was something else, something that defied explanation. The soldier's face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, his mouth open as if caught mid-scream. Around him were faint claw marks in the dirt, as though he'd been dragged there by something unnatural. The vanishing figure. As we prepared to leave with what remained of our platoon and equipment, I spotted a figure standing motionless on the side of the road ahead, a silhouette barely visible in the dim light of our flashlights. It looked like Locadio. We stopped immediately and approached cautiously, weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the darkness. But when we reached where he should have been, there was nothing there but shadows. Shaken but determined to find answers, we returned to base later that night. As I recounted everything to my team, one of the guards interrupted me with an unsettling revelation. Sub-Lieutenant Locadio came back here last night. I froze. What do you mean? I asked. He showed up around midnight, the guard explained calmly. Said he forgot his wallet and left quickly, but there were 5 dogs following him. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what he'd just told me. How could Locadio have been at base if he disappeared after the crash? And why would he be followed by dogs, especially in this desolate region where no strays roamed? The howls in the night. That night, none of us slept. The air around camp felt heavy with unease, and every sound seemed amplified. The rustling leaves, distant chirps of crickets, and then came the howls. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder as midnight approached. It wasn't just one dog. It sounded like an entire pack circling our camp. Yet no matter how hard we looked or how far our flashlights reached into the darkness beyond our perimeter, we saw nothing. One soldier swore he saw glowing eyes watching us from between 2 trees near our camp's edge. Another claimed he heard whispers mingled with the howls. A woman's voice calling his name softly but insistently. By dawn, everyone was on edge. We gathered around a hastily built fire for warmth and comfort as we waited for daylight to chase away whatever horrors lurked in those mountains. Looking back now, I can't explain what happened that night or during those harrowing days in Guerrero's Curse Mountains. All I know is this: something malevolent stalked us, something beyond human comprehension or control. And sometimes warnings come too late. Story 3. Shadows in the camp. Mysterious events happened at the base. The base was nestled in a remote valley, surrounded by dense forests and jagged mountains. It had been our home for weeks now, but something about it always felt wrong. The air was heavy, as if the mountains themselves were pressing down on us. At night, the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howls that none of us could identify. It started with small things. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps outside their tents late at night, but when they checked, no one was there. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, on walls, across the campgrounds, even inside the tents. At first, we chalked it up to exhaustion and paranoia. After all, we were operating under constant stress, and the isolation didn't help. But then things escalated. The woman in the night. One night, a soldier named Samuel, nicknamed La Parka for his grim sense of humor, approached me with a strange story. He claimed that a woman had visited him while he was on guard duty near the edge of camp. She was beautiful, he said, with long black hair and a soft voice that seemed to echo in his head. She told him she had come to say goodbye and warned him to be careful because this place had been touched by evil. I asked him what she looked like in detail, but his answer unsettled me. She was beautiful, but I can't remember her face. He shrugged it off as a dream or hallucination brought on by fatigue, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Something about the encounter had shaken him deeply. The next morning, we found an altar behind our camp during a routine patrol. It was made of stone stacked into a pyramid about 5 feet high, stained with dried blood and surrounded by feathers and animal bones. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints or trails leading to it, but it looked fresh, as if it had been used recently. We destroyed it immediately and buried the remains under layers of dirt and rocks. I ordered everyone to keep quiet about it. We didn't need rumors spreading through an already anxious platoon. But that night, everything changed. The dogs that weren't dogs. Around midnight, I was woken by the sound of gunfire. I scrambled out of my tent to find my section implementing the defense plan, rifles aimed toward the western perimeter of the base. I yelled for a report, and one of my sergeants ran up to me, pale and shaking. "It's La Parka," he said breathlessly. "He's firing at something near the cemetery." I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and headed toward La Parka's position with a small group of soldiers. We found him sitting against a tree, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands and his pants soaked with urine. His eyes were wide with terror as he pointed toward the cemetery. "Dogs," he whispered hoarsely. "3 of them, but they weren't dogs." I turned my flashlight toward the cemetery and saw them. 3 figures moving slowly among the gravestones. At first glance, they looked like stray dogs. Mangy fur, thin bodies, glowing eyes reflecting back at us in the beam of light. But then one of them stood up on its hind legs. It wasn't just standing, it was walking, step by step. Its movements were unnervingly human-like as it turned to face us fully. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine for what felt like an eternity, before it turned and walked back into the darkness. I raised my rifle and pulled the trigger instinctively, but nothing happened. The gun jammed twice before one of my sergeants placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's useless," he said quietly. "Let's go." We retreated to camp without another word. The fire circle. That night, I ordered everyone to gather around a large fire in the center of camp. We sat in a circle with our backs to the flames, weapons ready as we waited for dawn. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle from beyond our perimeter. When morning finally came, I called for reinforcements from headquarters under the pretense of needing additional manpower for operations. In truth, I just wanted more people around, safety in numbers. But even with reinforcements, things didn't improve. La Parka's nightmare. A few nights later, La Parka suffered what we thought was a seizure. He was found lying on his cot, with his eyes wide open but unresponsive. When he finally came to hours later, he told us something that made my blood run cold. He said he had seen a woman standing over him during the night. The same woman he'd described before, with her hand pressed against his chest. She whispered to him not to move because there was danger nearby. He tried to wake up but couldn't. It felt like her hand was pinning him down. I tried to reassure him that it was just a nightmare brought on by stress, but deep down, I knew better. The final encounter. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, during another midnight patrol near the cemetery. This time, multiple soldiers reported seeing figures moving among the trees, shadows that darted between trunks faster than any human could move. One soldier swore he saw Locadio, the officer who had disappeared during the convoy accident, standing at the edge of camp. But when he called out to him, Locadio simply turned and walked into the forest without a word. That same night, we heard howling again, louder this time, and saw glowing eyes surrounding our camp from every direction. We fired warning shots into the air until dawn broke over the mountains and silence returned. By then, morale was shattered. Soldiers refused to go on patrol alone or stand guard at night without backup. Even I began carrying religious items, a cross around my neck and a Bible in my pack, for protection against whatever evil lurked in those mountains. We left that base 3 months later when our mission ended, but none of us ever truly left behind what we experienced there. To this day, I can still hear those howls in my nightmares and see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Some places are simply cursed, marked by something beyond human understanding. And all you can do is pray you make it out alive, because not everyone does. Story 4. The Possession of La Parka. It began subtly at first. La Parka, once the most light-hearted and jovial soldier in our unit, started to change. He was always the one cracking jokes, lifting morale, and even flirting with the local women whenever we passed through villages. But after that night near the cemetery, when he fired at the strange dogs and saw one rise onto its hind legs, something shifted in him. He became withdrawn, quiet, and distant. At first, we thought it was just fear or shock from the encounter. After all, we were all shaken by what we had seen. But soon, it became clear that this was something far worse. The first signs. One morning, I was woken by frantic shouting outside my tent. I rushed out to find a small group of soldiers gathered around La Parka, who was lying on the ground, his body rigid and his eyes wide open but unseeing. The medic was checking his pulse and trying to get a response from him. When I knelt beside him and called his name, his eyes suddenly snapped to mine. He sat up abruptly, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. "I'm fine," he said hoarsely, brushing off everyone's concern. But there was something in his eyes, a hollow emptiness that hadn't been there before. Later that day, I pulled him aside to ask what had happened. He hesitated before finally speaking. "I couldn't wake up," he said quietly. "There was the woman standing over me. She put her hand on my chest and told me not to move because there was danger nearby." I tried to reassure him that it was just a nightmare brought on by stress, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The night of the howls. A few nights later, the base descended into chaos again. It started with a single gunshot in the dead of night, followed by a burst of automatic fire. I scrambled out of my tent, shouting for a report as soldiers rushed to implement the defense plan. The shots had come from La Parka's post near the western perimeter. When we reached him, we found him sitting against a tree with his rifle between his legs and his pants soaked in urine. His hands were trembling as he pointed toward the cemetery. "They're back," he whispered. We turned our flashlights toward where he was pointing and saw 3 figures moving among the gravestones. At first glance, they looked like stray dogs, thin and mangy with glowing eyes reflecting our light beams. But then one of them stood up on its hind legs again. It wasn't just standing, it was walking toward us with slow, deliberate steps. I raised my rifle instinctively and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. My weapon jammed twice before one of my sergeants placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's useless," he said quietly. "Let's go." We retreated to camp without firing another shot. La Parka disappears. The next morning, La Parka seemed even more withdrawn than before. He barely spoke during roll call and avoided eye contact with anyone. That night, I assigned 2 soldiers to keep watch over him while he slept. But despite our precautions, he vanished. We found his cot empty at dawn, his boots still neatly placed beside it and his rifle untouched. A search party combed through the surrounding forest for hours, but found no trace of him until late that night, when we heard rustling in the bushes near camp. La Parka stumbled out of the darkness, completely naked and covered in scratches, as if he had been attacked by an animal. He was muttering incoherently about being trapped in a pit filled with bones and red ribbons. When we finally managed to calm him down enough to speak coherently, he told us what had happened. "I woke up in a place I didn't recognize," he said shakily. "Locadio was there, but he wouldn't turn around to face me. He just kept telling me not to move." He described being attacked by an unseen force that clawed at his body before he passed out again. When he woke up, an old man on a mule guided him back toward camp with cryptic instructions. "Don't run. Just walk straight ahead until you see the tree with red leaves." The possession. From that point on, La Parka's condition worsened rapidly. He began having violent outbursts during which it took multiple soldiers to restrain him. His voice would change, deepening unnaturally, and he would speak in languages none of us recognized. One night during a patrol mission, he suddenly dropped his gear and walked off into the forest without warning. When we caught up to him moments later, he turned to us with a chilling smile and said in a voice that wasn't his own, "You can't stop it, it's already here." We carried him back to camp and tied him down for his own safety after he tried to attack one of the medics who was treating his wounds. Over the next few days, La Parka's episodes became more frequent and intense. At one point, He stopped breathing altogether and went into cardiac arrest 3 times in one night. But each time we managed to revive him against all odds. The evacuation. Eventually, it became clear that we couldn't handle this on our own anymore. We radioed for medical evacuation under the pretense that La Parka had suffered a psychological breakdown due to stress. A story that wouldn't raise too many questions back at headquarters. When the ambulance arrived to take him away, La Parka seemed calm for the first time in weeks. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, he turned to me and said softly, "Read Psalm 91 tonight, you'll need it." Those were the last words I ever heard from him. Aftermath. Months later, after I had transferred out of Guerrero's cursed mountains, I learned from fellow soldiers that La Parka had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and discharged from service into his family's care. But when I visited his home out of concern for my former comrade, his grandmother accused us of bringing this curse upon him by ignoring local warnings about witchcraft in the region. La Parka himself appeared briefly at the door but said nothing. His hollow eyes and eerie smile haunted me for weeks afterward. To this day, I don't know what truly happened to La Parka or what malevolent force took hold of him during those fateful months in Guerrero's mountains, but I pray every night that it never finds me again. Story 5. The Ritual of Protection. The events surrounding La Parka's transformation had shaken all of us to our core. The strange occurrences, the shadows, the howling dogs, the walking figure that wasn't human, had left us questioning everything we thought we knew about reality. But what truly terrified us was the realization that whatever malevolent force had been stalking us wasn't done yet. It lingered, watching, waiting. After La Parka's violent outbursts and his chilling descriptions of being trapped in a pit with bones and ribbons, I knew we had to do something. The soldiers were on edge. Morale was at an all-time low, and fear was spreading like wildfire through the camp. We couldn't fight this thing with bullets or strategy. It was beyond anything we'd been trained to handle. So, I made a decision I never thought I would. I turned to faith and ritual, the priest's blessing. I sent one of my most trusted corporals to Tlapa Common-Fort, the nearest town, with strict instructions. Find a priest and bring back whatever religious items he could get his hands on, holy water, crosses, anything. The corporal returned the next day with 3 bottles of holy water, a handful of wooden crucifixes, and a small book of psalms. He told me the priest had blessed everything and instructed us to place the crosses around the base and recite Psalm 91 every night before sleeping. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged mountains and darkness crept over the camp, we gathered around a large fire in the center of the base. The air was cold and heavy with tension. I handed out the crosses to each soldier and explained what we were going to do. "I know some of you might not believe in this," I said, my voice steady despite my own doubts. "But whatever is out there, it's not natural. And if this can protect us, even just a little, we owe it to ourselves to try." We formed a circle around the fire, holding our crosses tightly as one of the sergeants read Psalm 91 aloud. "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." As he spoke, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we were doing something, anything, to fight back against the darkness. The first night, that night was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant howls were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I stayed awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep, sitting by the dying embers of the fire with my rifle across my lap and a cross clutched in my hand. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to nod off, I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like my name, Betancur. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, as I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Betancur, come closer." My heart pounded in my chest as I stood slowly, gripping my rifle tightly. The voice was coming from just beyond the perimeter of our camp, near the cemetery where we had seen those things. I took a step forward but stopped myself. Something about the voice felt wrong. like it wasn't coming from a person at all, but from something pretending to be human. Suddenly, one of the crosses we had placed around camp fell over with a loud thud. The sound snapped me out of my trance, and I backed away from the edge of camp, retreating to my tent where I stayed until dawn. The marked soldier. The next morning, one of my soldiers came to me looking pale and shaken. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal 3 deep scratches running down his arm. Scratches he swore hadn't been there when he went to bed. "It felt like something was holding me down," he said quietly. "I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then I woke up with these." I didn't know what to say. The scratches were real. Angry red welts that looked like they had been made by claws rather than human nails. That afternoon, we reinforced our defenses, not just militarily but spiritually. We poured holy water around the perimeter of camp and placed additional crosses at every entrance. Some soldiers even pinned small crucifixes inside their uniforms for extra protection. The shadow at dusk. That evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, one of my sergeants came running into camp shouting for me. He led me to a spot near the western edge of our base, where several soldiers were gathered, their faces pale with fear. "Look," one of them whispered, pointing toward a tree just beyond our perimeter. At first, I didn't see anything, but then it moved. A shadowy figure stood beneath the tree, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It didn't move like a person. It swayed unnaturally, its limbs bending at odd angles, as if it were trying to mimic human movement, but failing horribly. One soldier raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air, but instead of running away, the figure stepped closer. I shouted for everyone to fall back toward camp, as I grabbed one of the bottles of holy water and hurled it toward the figure. The bottle shattered against a rock near its feet, spilling its contents onto the ground. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw it recoil as if in pain before disappearing into thin air. The final prayer. That night was our breaking point. We gathered around the fire once more, reciting Psalm 91 with more urgency than ever before. Some soldiers cried openly. Others clung to their crosses like lifelines. As we finished praying, La Parca, who had been unusually quiet since his return, spoke up for the first time in days. "It won't stop," he said softly. "Not until it gets what it wants." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and stared into the flames. The next morning, we received orders to relocate our base further down into the valley, a welcome reprieve from whatever haunted those mountains. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever malevolent force had plagued us wasn't finished yet. And as we drove away from that cursed place for good, I swore I heard faint howls echoing through the trees behind us. Even now, years later, I still carry that small book of Psalms with me wherever I go, a reminder that some battles can't be fought with weapons alone. Whatever evil lurked in those mountains may still be there waiting for its next victims. Horror fans, if you enjoyed these real horror encounters of ex-military officer, then do subscribe to Horror Vault channel to watch our new and interesting horror stories based on the real events. See you in the next video.